How much time do you have? How many minutes?
I can try and do it between us.
Okay, I'll do my best.
It appears I did cede my time to Nigel. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the organizers, and I'd also like to recognize the indigenous owners of this land. So I want to start out by saying I don't speak for the United States. I'm not in any official capacity. I'm an academic. And so what I'm going to try and do is describe to you the process that's been used in the U.S. to look at the treaty and the various positions that have come forward, and then to the extent that I can, give an educated guess as to why those interests and positions have been taken. Some are more educated than others. I know from observing and from interviewing people in the basin, but others are just from knowing something about the process and interests in water in general. But I am not in any official capacity here. So just to make that clear. Since I learned that these PowerPoints would be up on the website, I added these two URLs for you for future. As was mentioned, I'm part of the university's consortium on Columbia River governance, along with Richard and Nigel on this panel. We're a group of representatives of public universities in the basin that have worked to provide education and research for stakeholders in the basin and also hold cross-border dialogues. And you can find our information at that first website. And then secondly, Nigel and I have worked together, and you have one of the reports on your tables from our work, underfunding from the Program on Water Issues at the Munk School of Global Affairs. And we've provided information on the processes that the United States and Canada must go through in deciding to negotiate changes to an international treaty, and also on mechanisms for having greater flexibility in a treaty going forward. So from the bottom URL, you can find that in electronic form, the two reports in electronic form if you prefer that form. So I'm going to start, and I really appreciate that Paul kind of queued it up for this. It's going to make it look like we actually did coordinate here. In understanding why people have reached various positions on the future of the Columbia River Treaty, it really helps to think about first what's changed since 1964. So I'm just going to go really briefly through what I think are the four most important changes since 1964. The first one is that energy demand and markets have not turned out as we predicted in 1964. So people thought that the hydropower system on the Columbia River would not be worth nearly as much today in relative terms as it was in 1964, and that was because we had a rapid growth in demand, and that would mean that we would have to switch for our base load, our sort of assured power that we get, to something like nuclear power, and hydropower would only be peaking power. Well, that hasn't proven true, because in the process of responding to the oil embargo in the 1970s, we learned about conservation. And even though that crisis ended, we continued to conserve. And today, hydropower is still our most important energy source in this region, and it's extremely valuable. And most of our new energy is coming from renewables. Climate change. 1964, we did not predict this. And what's shown here are, let me go back, are just two of the things that we see because of that really affect the system as we know it in the Columbia River. The maps on your left here show, first of all, that predictions for the Columbia River are that we will have basically about the same amount of precipitation, maybe even in the coastal areas and in Upper British Columbia more. However, what this ugly red map shows is the overall water deficit, because increasing temperatures mean that we will have increasing use of water by vegetation. So that's not looking at increased demand of water by people or by crops, but just natural vegetation having a longer growing season, using more water. So a water deficit, which certainly affects everything we do with water in the Columbia Basin. And what you see on this map is something that's already measured, and that is a change in timing of runoff. You heard this morning that what we're seeing with climate change is a change from snow to rain, and particularly in the lower latitudes and lower elevation watersheds in the United States, we've already seen a flip from snow-dominated to rain-dominated. That means we can't rely as much on natural storage in the form of snowpack. That means runoff is earlier. We also have seen major changes in the ecosystem, a lot of it being due to impacts from dams. And so courtesy, a number of these slides, these two come courtesy of CRIPFIC. And what we see in this one, the pink areas are parts of the basin that are now blocked, that were spawning habitat for salmon and are now blocked from salmon due to dams. And in the United States, as Nigel mentioned, that has led to the listing of a number of species from the Columbia River Basin under our Endangered Species Act. All of these species here, I believe it's 13 salmon and steelhead populations representing different runs, and then a resident species, the bull trout. And the red lines on this map are the points of blockage from former spawning grounds. And then the other effect of the dams is flow. It's changed the hydrographs. So from having a peak flow that used to flush a lot of the smolts, the smaller fish, after they've spawned and grown a little bit, out to sea in a very short time period, now we've flattened that out, and the fish actually have to expend a great deal of energy getting out to the ocean. That means it reduces recruitment or survival of those species. And what I think the fourth change that's occurred, and the most profound, and you've heard this talked about all day long in the form of values, changes in values. It's not that we didn't know when we put the dams in that they would affect the fishery. In fact, you can go back through the archives and see all kinds of letters from the Fish and Game departments of different states and the province saying what this will do. It's that we care. As a dominant society, certainly a number of people cared then, but the dominant society cares more. And what's really the story is that along with that, we've seen voices that in 1964 would have been marginalized and not at the table at all have greatly increased in capacity to participate in these sorts of forums. And that is a huge story, and you see it just in the different things that I've put up here. The fact that since 1982, there's a requirement of consultation in Canada with Aboriginal people. You have the Columbia Basin Trust that works in the basin on education and economic development. You have the tribes, there are 15 reservations within the U.S. portion of the basin, but in the 1970s, 4 of those reservations were very successful in asserting treaty fishing rights, very sophisticated now in policy and fisheries management, and considered co-managers at the table. Those voices cannot be ignored today as they were in 1964. And then finally, the states actually have an interstate compact through which they cooperate on power planning and fish and wildlife. So huge changes within the basin. Looking at the empowerment and capacity, particularly of Native American voices, I just wanted to give 2 pieces of evidence of that. In 1910, the 15 tribes in the basin who do have very different interests, particularly between those who have salmon and whose former fishing grounds have been blocked from salmon. Nevertheless, in an exercise of very sophisticated diplomacy, came together and reached an agreement on a document that they call the Common Views on the Columbia River Treaty, and so far have managed to work together in that process. and the second thing that the tribes in the basin have done, and also the interstate entity have suggested, is to look at fish passage past Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams, getting anadromous fish back into the upper Columbia. So these are huge pieces of evidence that the voices at the table have changed. So with that, let's look at the U.S. process of review and what the results of that were, and then what might happen going forward. So the process was very different than it was in 1964, when basically very powerful people in the State Department, led by the State Department, sat at the table and negotiated the agreement. Well, what they did was a regional review process led by the entities that Nigel mentioned actually operate the river under the treaty. They invited to the table for monthly meetings what was called the Sovereign Review Team. 5 people representing the 15 Native American reservations, 1 person representing each of the states, the main states within the basin, and then also representatives from the 11 federal agencies within the basin that manage land within the basin. That group really worked together to formulate the positions. They had representatives on what was referred to as the Sovereign Technical Team to study those positions, and they met on a monthly basis. There were also basin-wide listening sessions to obtain input from all of the other basins, in all of the other interests in the basin. In December of 2013, they transmitted their recommendation. Now, the region cannot take a position. The Department of State, the executive branch of the federal government, speaks for the United States. So they transmitted their recommendation to the Department of State. That recommendation wanted to keep flood control and hydropower as 2 of the purposes of the treaty. They wanted flood control to target, to target the lower level of flood risk, 450,000 CFS as a maximum at the Dalles. As Nigel mentioned, under hydropower, they wanted to see reduction in the Canadian entitlement, and I'll explain that a little more. Given that a number of people, and particularly the sovereigns at the table, wanted a greater public voice and certainly a greater Indigenous voice in operation of the system going forward, they recommended to revisit the composition of the U.S. entity for operation. But the most profound change that reflects those changes since 1964 was the recommendation that ecosystem function be elevated to a 3rd purpose of the treaty, and particularly in the form of augmenting spring and summer flows. Okay, well, that happened. That was transmitted to Department of State in December 2013. Silence fell. And in 2014 and 2015, the congressional delegation from the basin, so that would be our representatives in the Senate and the House of Representatives, transmitted letters not stating a position, because I wouldn't say if in that capacity that the states would all be in agreement on what they want to see, but being in agreement that we would like the State Department to seek to commence negotiations with Canada on the Columbia River Treaty. We do have now what's supposed to be not public, an unofficial letter back to the delegation in 2015 from the Department of State saying they are moving forward and intend to adopt a position that is consistent with the regional recommendation. That's not an official letter, so whether that's actually the position that will come out from the Department of State, I can't speak to, but that's where it stands, so we expect something, hopefully, this year. Okay, so what I wanted to take just a little bit of time to talk about are the issues. You saw from what Nigel said, and seeing me outline the various positions from the regional recommendation. what are the differences between the BC position and the U.S. regional recommendation, and what might be some ways to narrow them? And the ones I'm going to focus on are the level of flood control, the calculation of the Canadian entitlement, which I don't have a way to narrow that, but I'll just explain a little bit more about it, and then the ecosystem function, and then some pure speculation on why it's taking the Department of State so long to reach a position. Okay, so flood control level, you see the United States saying we want the least possible risk, 450,000 CFS, and you see Canada saying, well, no, really, post-2024, it's only 600,000 CFS. One way that you can narrow positions in a negotiations when they go to something as technical as this is to take a closer scientific look at it. It turns out there has been no comprehensive study at what level flooding actually occurs, and at the lower levels, what the economic cost or potential risk to the public that flooding is. I have a master's student now, Patrick Johnson, who's doing what I would call a reconnaissance level survey, certainly not the level of study to base a policy recommendation on. He's looking, you know, what's amazing when he started looking into it is no one's really tracked this. So from the information from the Army Corps of Engineers, 86 days since 1974, and it's 1974 instead of 64 because we had to wait till the dams were actually in. So 86 days have exceeded 450,000 CFS. No one has kept track on what the harm was on those 86 days. However, he's done archival review of newspaper articles. One picture from one of the 86 days is a park bench underwater. Only one of those 86 days could he find a picture of a road being slightly flooded. Looking at that, what he's doing is providing information to help with those in the basin, particularly the 15 Native American tribes have been asking the Army Corps to do a comprehensive study because just maybe we could agree to 600, or at least 500 or 550, narrow that gap with just some minor changes, local structural measures, or even better, if we're trying to improve ecosystem function, local places where we can reconnect the river to its floodplain and provide habitat in addition to narrowing this gap. Okay, as I said, I don't have any magic bullet for the split the baby argument in terms of the Canadian entitlement, but I love this picture for sort of illustrating to you what it is and why it's an issue. So you can obviously tell by the little red symbol which of the dams are Canadian. And when water is released from those dams, they run through, and that water runs through and produces hydropower at every single one of the dams down below it. It's a huge amount of additional hydropower. And so that incremental amount that's made possible by release of that water is split 50-50 between the U.S. and Canada. The treaty sets it out as an amount of power, but Canada has never needed that full amount of power, and so it is sold back to utilities in the United States. And that is why you will often hear the Canadian entitlement characterized in monetary terms. And so it fluctuates with the market. The additional 30-year sale were through contracts paid for upfront to utilities in the United States. Since those contracts expired, it's fluctuated on the market. Just during the time, about 6 or 7 years now that I've been studying this process, it's fluctuated between a high of around $350 million per year to a low that it would be at now, I think, which is maybe someone can correct me, but maybe around 90 million, and that's because of the huge increase in natural gas driving energy prices down. For the United States, when they spill water to comply with Endangered Species Act, because even though they have an international treaty, if a new law passed afterwards, like the Endangered Species Act, requires a change, they have to comply with it. So They don't want to comply with that. In complying with it, breached the treaty. So what the United States does is spills water and nevertheless pays Canada as if they produced or provides the electricity as if they produce that. So the United States, from the viewpoint of utilities in the U.S., they get hit twice. They have to spill water for fish, and then they have to compensate as if they produced it. So that's the issue there. Ecosystem function. I do not know the reasons, and I won't speculate why the BC position sees ecosystem function as a separate issue, but I can see some of the problems with including it within a treaty. If you're looking at an international treaty for something as complex as ecosystem, it's a little bit scary because you're locking something into place. As was said earlier, the legacy effects of these major agreements, it's hard to turn the aircraft carrier. And so the treaty itself really affects flow and timing of flow. So to the extent that is necessary for ecosystem function, that probably has to be dealt with in the treaty if you're going to address it. But one of the studies that Nigel and I did for the Munk School of Global Affairs looked at other models, and this is the one that we came up with as a possible way to, if you deal with flow in the treaty, to have other mechanisms for cooperating across the international boundary that might be more flexible. And the Great Lakes Compact and Agreement substantively isn't a model. It deals with out-of-basin transfers, not an issue in the Columbia River Treaty, but the way it's set up. And so it's a compact between the states in the United States and an informal, rather than a formal, international agreement between the states and the provinces, in which substantial information is exchanged and coordination occurs. Has participation by tribes and First Nations that in the Columbia you might want to elevate to a higher level. But this allows you to address issues that, although they may have cross-border implications, are profoundly local in nature, as we've heard already. If you have to restore habitat in a particular area, if you have to put fish passage through a particular area, those have profound local implications as well as cross-border. How do you do something like this? This might be a model. Finally, I just wanted to touch on, do I have about 5 minutes still? 3. Okay, so I just want to touch on, the United States always gives away that time and stuff. We're just so soft. It's really a problem. So why are we waiting for State Department? You know, what's going on there? And I do know there's a representative of state in the room, so I'll just speak freely and I won't call you out to tell us really why. So my speculation, so under U.S. Constitution, negotiation of an international treaty authority lies solely with the executive. They can, though, delegate that to anyone. They could say, we're going to set up a committee that has representatives of the states and the tribes, and they are going to work with us to negotiate this treaty. So nothing prevents something like that. But we have a process for approving that international agreement. And the one you'd probably would know most about is the advice and consent of the Senate. That's what happened with the 1964 treaty. It gets taken to the Senate. 2/3 have to vote for it. Well, it turns out that that's not the only way for an international agreement. In fact, 95% of the international agreements since World War II have been unilateral executive agreements done either under the constitutional authority of the president, the executive branch, or taking a very broad view of an existing treaty, like, for example, the 1964 Columbia River Treaty. Now, the problem with that is generally it can only be done with congressional acquiescence. And that's where we have the problem. We have the regional recommendation in which a lot of people came together and it went forward, but immediately following its transmittal to state, things started to fracture a little bit and different interests started lobbying their congressional people for a better deal. That's what puts state and the congressional representatives in a very difficult position, because you're not going to have if that gets worse, greater fractionation in the basin. It's going to be very hard to simply negotiate under the authority of the existing treaty. So probably working that out is one of the issues that Department of State is facing right now. I just wanted to give an example of the Idaho House last year passed a joint memorial saying they did not agree with the ecosystem function aspect of the regional recommendations. So that's just an example. Finally, I'd like to say one thing, going back to a comment this morning that was made that, actually going back to Paul's comment that crisis creates a window of opportunity. And what we see in this basin is that not really a crisis, a small thing, the expiration of part of the flood control provisions, but combined with very extensive change within the basin is creating this window of opportunity. And this morning it was mentioned that, yeah, you can have change during a drought or some kind of crisis, and it happened in Australia, and as soon as it rained, everything backslid. Well, not really. And I just spent 6 months in Australia studying that. And yes, the rhetoric as soon as it rained started to backslide. But they had made huge investment in changes in infrastructure, and they had reformed their water laws. You can't backslide on that. We've talked about legacy effects. The legacy of this generation is the next future of the Columbia River. If you memorialize the changes you want in changes in the law and in changes in infrastructure, they will last. There can be some backsliding, but it is very hard to turn the aircraft carrier once you've put it in place. I'll conclude with that.
I think the way to do this is to get the sound guy to turn each of their mics on at the table. Can he do that? Then we don't have all these people huddled around the mic up front here arguing about who's going to respond with which question. Let's take a question. Take a question. First of all, here we wait for the mic. Now, what I did, Nigel, we had your mics turned on, so you can answer right there at your places.